pleasure to be with you on this 1st of May. Today and yesterday, we got our first northern orioles and hummingbirds showing up. So it really feels like migration is underway, and we're starting to get some of our residents that are here for the summer. So what I'd like to talk to you about is the title suggests Nutritional and Physiological Ecology of Migratory Birds, and very much its management implications. So by the time I'm done, I'm hoping that you understand what nutritional and physiological ecologists like me sort of do in terms of investigations of wild birds. And one of the stories I'm going to tell you about are very much the product of a company of folks, mostly graduate students, postdocs, and research colleagues. So throughout, I'm going to try to emphasize who some of those folks are and what they do. So the picture here is our study area. It's the flattened earth. Basically, if you study migratory birds, you get to go pretty much in every square inch of the earth, because that's where migratory birds go. And one of the reasons why I study them, I like to travel just like the migratory birds. And so we'll talk a little bit today about sort of some of those travels. So this is the way that migratory bird folks view the earth, the flattened earth in this case. And what's superimposed on the earth there are the highways, or as we like to call them, the flyways that birds use as they navigate the globe, usually across seasons. And what do you notice about those flyways? You know, they seem to be oriented in certain ways, mostly north to south. And that's because most birds that are migrating are moving from more temperate areas in the northern parts of the North America in our case, and then moving towards the tropics. Mind you, the same thing happens for southern hemisphere species. They move from more temperate regions towards the tropics as well. So we sort of have this piecemeal movement across the earth during these migration periods. And if you study that with migratory birds, typically one of the things you do is you put transmitters on birds and you track them throughout the earth. And so here's some studies that we've been involved with for the last 15 years for eastern sea ducks. So there's the cast of characters. This is work that Juliet Lamb, one of our postdocs, has been working on. And each of those pies that occurs throughout North America are areas that one or more of these species hang out in for some period of time. So you can see in the northern parts, these are colored sort of this orangish. That's where long-tailed ducks breed. Over here, the white-winged scoters are, and so forth. So these pies represent the proportion of each of those species. And all I really want you to notice in here is this is a network of places where these 5 species hang out for periods of time. And especially for some of these species, areas like southern Hudson Bay and James Bay are really important areas in spring migration and also in fall when they molt. And then areas where I live, which is in the mid-Atlantic, are really important areas for birds during the winter. And so from these movement studies, you can get a sense of where are the important places on Earth, when do they use them during the annual cycle, and all these are directly related to conservation efforts. In particular, for the sea ducks, if you take one species, in this case black scoters, so now we're focusing in on just the southern New England area. So here's Rhode Island, where I'm sitting today, in between Boston and New York City, if you've never been to this neck of the woods. And what I've shown you is, again, these are movement studies of black scoters, and the colors here in red show the concentration areas for this, in this case, black scoters. The blue is where 95% of the time they're hanging out. And so you can see there's certain places that are particularly important for black scoters during winter. So why is that relevant? Well, we have offshore wind energy development, the first in North America. And the first offshore wind energy development that happened about 5 years ago was positioned right here. And our studies were used in the process of siting those. So they actually avoided, this is that same area here, Block Island, they avoided areas that the birds actually frequented mostly. And so they didn't put any offshore wind energy development here, they focused it here, but now there's looming about a 200 turbine site that they're currently trying to permit. And so these kinds of studies that we're doing with movement informs the siting process. And that's the management implications of these kinds of things. And the work has been done with multiple species, same kind of context, same kind of important information about that informs the siting of these kinds of areas. Last example of this sort of movement kind of data comes from studies of a very interesting shorebird. It's called the American woodcock. You don't have those out in Texas, as far as I know. They get as far west as Oklahoma and Nebraska. So it's an eastern species, but it's a very important game bird in New England especially. And it's a shorebird that lives in the forest. So it beguiles its name and decides to inhabit forest. And from movement studies, telemetry studies, here's the state of Rhode Island. And in red are the places where the birds like to really hang out. And in the softer colors and the blues are places where they're not. And this kind of map directly informs where forest management occurs in New England and in Rhode Island in particular. And this is the cast of characters that have been involved in that kind of work. So the first part of my talk, very briefly, was meant to just sort of orient you to one of the things that nutritional ecologists, resource selection kind of biologists do, and that is we use telemetry to track birds and use that information in a variety of ways to inform management. So I'm actually not going to talk any more about sort of movement studies. What I want to really focus on today are what Maureen and others wanted me to focus on, which was more nutritional ecology related kinds of studies. And so I'm going to tell you about 3 stories today. One's about how we manage habitat for wintering waterfowl. The second one is about nutritional requirements and especially how much protein birds need during migration. And then the last story will be about how micronutrients, certain kinds of fats and certain kinds of dietary antioxidants matter for birds during migration. And the main theme, the one I want you to leave with, is that nutrition and physiology really matters for wildlife management, for management of migratory birds. So let's talk about this first one. So waterfowl are managed, wintering waterfowl are managed in many places in North America along the lines of what's called using a bioenergetic model for waterfowl habitat management. And what it basically means is you figure out how much food the birds need, and you figure out how many birds you want to have on the landscape, and then you manage that landscape for the food that's needed for that particular population. And it doesn't matter where this is. This could be in Central South Texas at your favorite national wildlife refuge, but many places that manage for wintering waterfowl do it in this way. And so what I want to do is show you sort of under the hood what you need to know to apply this kind of approach. And here's how it works. So in the upper left here, you have to know what the energy requirements are for your favorite species of bird. So this is daily energy expenditure. And there's my favorite bird. It's the smallest of Canada geese. It's called a cackling Canada goose. It's about the size of a mallard. They only occur, they breed up in Alaska and they go down to Central Valley of California during winter. And right behind it is a Ross's goose, that white goose. That's the namesake for my son, Ross. And then there's a white-fronted goose sort of snuck in. So if you know the daily energy expenditure of birds, and you know how much food they need to eat to satisfy that daily energy expenditure, and you multiply up, do some simple math about how many birds you want on the landscape, you can get to here, okay? But I want to show you what we need to know to get to each of these points, because that's really the story of the importance of nutrition and physiology. All right, so here's what you need to know. Here's the so let's do this side first. So the total energy requirements of any animal, including you, involves how much do you need for energy when you're resting. So that's you sleeping. If you are expending no energy, you are dead. So you have some level of energy expenditure that you have to have even while you're resting. And then if you're active, there's an additional source of energy that you have to produce to sustain that activity. And if you're in a cold place, you have to add some thermoregulatory costs. And if you're reproducing or growing, there's additional costs. And if you happen to be getting fat or otherwise storing nutrients, there's an additional energy that you're consuming that ends up going into storage. So you add all that together and there's your daily energy expenditure. So in the case of these models that are used for waterfowl, we estimate the resting metabolic rate using this equation. It's just a number times the body mass of the bird to some exponent. Where the heck does that come from? Well, it comes from a bunch of studies by nutritional and physiological ecologists like me that have related the body mass of the bird on the x-axis to their metabolic rate. And so each of these points is a bunch of different species. And what I hope you notice is it's an incredibly tight linear relationship. So as you increase in body mass, the amount of energy that that bird expends just on rest increases, and it's very predictable. So all you need to know then is the body mass of the bird, and you plug it into that equation and you've got an estimate of resting metabolic rate. Nifty. And then we multiply that resting metabolic rate by 3. What's so magic about 3? Well, a bunch of physiology and nutrition studies have been done that have measured the cost of all the various behaviors that birds tend to enlist in. So whether they're courting, whether they're flying, whether they're feeding, whether they're resting, and it's been estimated that they cost this much times the resting metabolic rate. So if a bird's flying, it's 13 times more costly than resting. If it's walking or aggressive, it's about 2 times. Okay. And if you take an average time budget for a bird and average all those costs, it's roughly 3 times the resting metabolic rate. So that's why we estimate the activity costs of that. In our neck of the woods, in southern New England, when birds are wintering, it gets really cold. And so our contribution, this is work of Rick McKinney in his PhD work, was to estimate the costs of that thermoregulation. So we have some additional costs that anybody who would like to add those costs can do. Okay. And so there you have it. You have resting metabolic rate, you multiply by some activity costs. If there's thermoregulatory costs, you can add into those. And there we have daily energy expenditure. That's what we have in the upper left. And then to figure out how much food that means the bird needs, you have to estimate how much they get out of each bite of food. And that's called metabolizable energy. And so you do some studies, including some of our own, where you measure how much the bird's actually getting out of every bite that it eats. And you can convert then daily energy expenditure and the amount of food to this population level kind of thing. So I hope you've recognized just from this short example that there's a bunch of physiological studies that have gone into building up this base of the model that we use for waterfowl habitat management. All right, so that's our first story. Second story, how much protein and other requirements do birds have during migration? So the rest of the talk is going to be sort of about migration and some of the costs and requirements for birds during migration. And here's how I view migration in a bird. So here's time during migration on the x-axis. And when birds get ready to migrate, they go through this period of fattening. So they increase their body mass, and most of that is fat in the case of birds. And they do that by what we call hyperphagia. It just means they're eating lots. And oftentimes birds switch their diets to feed on things that facilitate their fattening. So they go through this fattening period. And then they reach a point at which they decide to depart. And during flight, most birds fast. Most birds fly at night. And so during that, and they can't feed during flight. So most birds then fly, they fast during that period, they lose some of that body mass and their fat reserves, and then they stop at a stopover. And they rebuild those fat stores, and then they migrate again. So migration is actually a series of feeding and fasting periods for most birds. And that has big consequences for how we manage areas where they stop. We need to facilitate that refueling as much as we can. And then we have to consider that birds fast during that flight, and that has consequences for how quickly they can regain their fat reserves. All right, so that's sort of a cartoon of what the dynamic life of birds during migration is. So we study birds during these stopovers, especially songbirds. And in the area, my favorite study area for migration, so here's Rhode Island again. I hope you remember where Rhode Island is from those earlier maps. Here's Block Island, where we do most of our studies. So this is about 20 kilometers off the coast. So as birds migrate south to the southern New England coast, they then have to start moving across parts of the Atlantic. And Block Island is one of those important places. And what we did was, well, this is an earlier study done by Jeff Parrish, and he looked at how much fat change there was in birds during the migration, and each of these dots is different species, okay? And so if there's a positive value of fat score, that means the bird's getting fat. If it's lower, it's actually used fat during the stopover. And this is data that comes from repeatedly catching and recatching individuals at the stopover. And so he related this fat score change to how much fruit the birds ate. And those birds that ate lots of fruits ended up being the ones that had a positive fat score change at stopover. Those that didn't feed on fruits very much had a lower kind of stopover. And so this was a hint to us early on that fruits during migration may be very important, especially in Eastern North American migrants. So we did some studies of what's in fruits. So we measured the amount of fat, the carbohydrate, the amount of protein in those fruits. And you have some fruits like viburnum, otherwise called arrowwood, and myrica, that's myrtleberry, have roughly equal amounts of fats and carbohydrates. And then others like pokeweed have very high levels of carbohydrates and very little fat. So these are the kinds of fruits that are more like strawberries. They are high in sugars, lower in fat. And one common denominator in all the fruits is that they have very low levels of protein. And this has led to the notion that fruits are okay for fattening and high carbohydrate, sugary things, but they don't give them enough protein. Okay. How do you know which of these fruits birds prefer? We do what we affectionately call a bagging technique. So you go out, you find a bunch of plants that of each of the various types of fruits, and on one branch you tag it at the base so you can come back and measure the fruits on that same exact branch time and time again. And then on a nearby branch, you put a bag over it that still lets it breathe, still lets it do its thing. It ripens, but it's not accessible to the birds. And we do that for a variety of different species. And this is work done by Adam Smith and Jessica Bolser. And what do you get from this kind of study? So in the dark are the enclosed bag fruits. And in the white are the ones that are exposed to bird predation. And then there's one other line on here that tells you how ripe the fruit is. And so what you can see is in the case of arrowwood in viburnum, it's already ripe when the birds arrive. This is early September, which is about the time when birds start arriving on Block Island in the fall. And in the enclosed one, it slowly loses its fruits. Basically, they become ripe and they fall off, okay? But in the ones that are exposed to the birds, you see a tremendously fast decline in the number of fruits. So arrowwood is a really favored fruit. It disappears fast when birds arrive, and we can demonstrate that by this sort of bagging technique. So here's a fruit that they don't like so much. First of all, it's not ripe when they first arrive, but even after it gets ripe, you can see that the enclosed and the open exposed one decline at about the same rates. So winterberry, not so much preferred. And so we did this for all the various fruits that were out there on Block Island. And we came up with a recommended list for private landowners who were being able to produce or plant fruits in coastal kinds of scrub environments where the birds tend to congregate. So here's our list of preferred fruits that we suggest to private landowners and agencies to plant. So viburnum is their all-time favorite. That stuff disappears super quick and it's gone if we get a good number of birds in a given fall. Pokeweed second, Virginia creeper, and so forth. And we tell people what the fat and carbohydrate content is. Part of the reason why we think viburnum is particularly favored is it has a high amount of fat as well as carbohydrate. And then the other ones are more like those sugary fruits. But the birds like them as well, just not quite as much. And one of the things that we ended up concluding back in the early 2000s was that some of these fruits were adequate for the protein requirements of birds, and some were not so. So they would have to mix or match or eat insects on top of feeding on their favorite fruit to satisfy their protein requirements. However, most of the studies that we relied on to figure out whether the fruit was adequate or not come from domesticated species. So we know a lot about protein requirements chickens because we have to grow them to grow up fast and be very high in muscles for our own consumption. Most of the protein requirements of wild bird information all comes from birds that were in non-migration state. So you catch a bird, a wild bird, you keep it in captivity for a short period of time, you measure its protein requirements. All those studies were done in birds that were not in migration state. So before the study that I'm just about to show you, we really knew nothing about protein requirements of birds in migration state. So again, I want to show you a little bit under the hood. How do you figure this kind of thing out? How do you figure out protein requirements of any animal, including you? Well, here's how you do it. You feed animals different diets with different amounts of protein. That means you're going to produce groups of birds that feed and intake different amounts of protein. So birds fed the high protein diet are going to consume more protein. Birds fed the low protein diet or consume less. They compensate to some extent, but they basically don't fully compensate. So you create this trajectory of different protein intakes, and then you measure protein balance. So that's the difference between protein in that they consume and that comes out. Yes, I mean in their feces. So these are studies where you collect all the feces of the birds, you know exactly how much they eat, you calculate how much they ate in terms of protein, you know how much came out in the feces, and you can come up with this zero balance line. So this is when anything above it, lots of protein, plenty, anything below it, you're not eating enough to maintain protein balance. And you calculate the requirement by where these two lines intersect. This is the minimum amount of protein that the bird needs to eat to satisfy its protein requirements. Okay, so we did this for hermit thrush and for white-throated sparrows. And we did it for birds in non-migration state, and then the same individuals, we got to go into migration state. How the heck do you do that? Well, one of the magic things, and I'm amazed every time it works, you just take birds, you keep them at normal ambient light that would occur during the breeding season, and then or during the winter, and then you increase light levels in the spring. That's how we did this study. So we caught birds, we kept them over into the winter on a constant light level, and then we started to increase the light levels in the spring. And very magically, birds go into migration state. How do we know that? They start eating a lot, and nothing else has changed. We've just changed the light level. They start eating a lot, and they become night active. So both these species are nocturnal migrants. And so we have little laser beams in the cages where we can tell how active they are. And normally during the night, during winter, they're just resting and sleeping. When they go into migration state, all of a sudden it's called Zugenruhe, named after the guy, the German who discovered the behavior. They become nocturnally active. So we can demonstrate that birds become migratory, and then we can measure their protein requirements during that time. All right, so what did we find? So here's the kind of data that you get and how you estimate the protein requirements. So this is the line for non-migration state. So these are both species combined because both species behaved in the same way. Here's the axis for how much protein they ate. So these are the birds fed lots of protein. Here's the birds fed low amounts of protein. And here's the zero balance line. So we estimated that birds in non-migration state needed about 8% dietary protein. All right, you ready for the punchline? So now we put birds in migration state. What happened? All of a sudden, this whole line shifts. That means for a certain amount of energy, of nitrogen intake, they're actually getting more protein intake. Okay, so the zero balance line shifts to the left. It means that birds only need 1% dietary protein when they're in this migration state. So there's some magic physiology that's happening that allows birds to sustain themselves on lower protein because their protein requirements as a percentage of their diet goes down. Cool. So what's the implication for this for fruit eating? So here's each of these numbers is different fruits. And I've plotted energy density of the fruit relative to its protein concentration. So I mentioned before that there were some fruits like viburnum that they absolutely loved, but that we thought would have inadequate protein. It has very low amounts of protein. And then there's other fruits like these that have relatively low energy, but lots of protein, plenty there. And this line is from what we thought before we did our study on birds in migration state. These are birds in non-migration state. So you would conclude that all these fruits have adequate protein. There's plenty. All these fruits would have inadequate. And like I said, that's what led to us saying that arrowwood was inadequate, okay? Here's the line, knowing what we know now, that birds during migration require a lot less percent dietary protein. Somewhat magically, all of a sudden, all the fruits have adequate protein. Cool. So that led us to modify our recommended list. Here's the same species that we know they like to eat, but now we say all fruits have adequate protein for birds during migration, okay? we don't think we need to worry about the protein content of these particular fruits. So what do we tell people to plant? We say variety is always good. Just make sure viburnum, the arrowwood, is in the mix, because that's their highly preferred and tends to have a nice amount of high fat. Okay, so that was the story about dynamics of protein requirements. I hope you found it interesting, and looking under the hood a little bit made it especially interesting to see sort of how we discover these kinds of things. All right, the last story is about the importance of micronutrients. So my colleagues and I are very fond of saying that migratory birds are like extreme athletes, like marathon runners, or in this case, Tour de France riders. This is Christopher Fromm, my favorite Tour de France winner. He was the 2016 winner. He's had a few accidents since then, so he's not been able to compete quite at the high level. But the reason why Christopher Fromm is interesting to me is he's a nutrition freak. So he became very interested in low fat, high protein diets. He leaned way down, and as a consequence, he won the 2016. Before that, he was sort of a middle of the road Tour de France rider. And so he was able to get to that elite level based in part on what he ate. And that's really what I study in migratory birds. So we like to compare our migratory birds to these extreme athletes, because they're flying for hours and hours and hours at a time. They're not eating when they're doing this. Tour de France riders, yeah, they get to consume as much as they like during that time. So the birds seem maybe even better than a Tour de France. Well, in fact, birds are quite unlike mammals when it comes to high intensity endurance exercise. In short, they're much better. First of all, birds exercise at very high intensities. I have here 80% of VO2 max. So VO2 max for you would be, I bring you into a sports facility, I put you on a treadmill, I turn it on as fast as I can, and you just run your tail off as fast as you possibly can, and I measure how much oxygen you consume. And whatever your 100% VO2 max is, if I had you maintain that for any length of time, you couldn't, right? You can run as fast as you possibly can for only a very short period of time. Well, birds operate when they fly at regularly 80% of their VO2 max, okay? A marathon runner usually goes at about 50. And if it tries to go any higher than that, it just can't sustain itself for any length of time. So birds are unlike mammals, first of all, in terms of the intensity with which they exercise. They also dust Tour de France riders. So there's been nice studies of the energetics of Tour de France riders. They're able to sustain about 7 times their basal metabolic rate, which is 2 or 3 times more than you and me. So they're still extreme athletes. But compared to birds, birds can operate for hours and hours at twice that of their basal metabolic rate. So 13 to 15 times when they're flying. And then the last thing that's relevant for today is birds use fat as their primary fuel. You use some fat for marathons, but it's a mostly carbohydrate driven thing. That's why pasta loading and things like that is important for marathon runners. If you start using during a marathon primarily fat, because you've burned up your carbohydrate stores, you will require more oxygen. You're going to need to slow down. Whereas birds use fat, about 95% of the fuel that they use is fats. So I hope I've convinced you that birds are endurance athletes, but in ways they accomplish it in ways that are quite different than you and me. So don't get me wrong, fats are important to us all. If you looked at yourself and you're an average human being, your left leg would be composed of entirely protein and your right leg would be, no, that's not what I mean. This is the rough amounts of your whole body that are composed of fat and protein. So you have roughly equal amounts. Most of you is water, and then small amounts of everything else. Okay, so fats are important to us. They compose all of our cell membranes, so they're critical. The other interesting things about fats is you are what you eat mostly. So if we eat, or if birds eat mostly saturated fats, most of our fat stores are composed of saturated fats. If we eat more polyunsaturated or monounsaturated, our fat stores also become composed mostly of that. And this is important for people like me who actually want to study experimentally how fatty acid composition, fat composition matters when it comes to migratory birds. And then the last thing I just want to point out is, what should we eat when it comes to certain kinds of fats and carbohydrates? In this case, which body is best for health and performance? So these are two Olympic scale athletes. They're obviously really different in terms of their composition. The guy on the right is your sprinter. The guy on the left is your marathoner. Okay. Is what they eat, should what they eat be the same thing? No, of course, it depends on the performance that we're talking about. Now, I'm actually not interested in humans very much. I'm more interested in what animals eat. So what fat should our favorite animals eat? And does this change seasonally? So here's a small mammal that's in hibernation. Same thing for some bats. There's some snakes. There's bears that don't officially hibernate, but they go through long periods of quiescence. And then here's some of my favorite migratory birds. So what fats should our favorite animals eat? And does this change with seasonal demands? That's really what I'm going to address in the last part of this talk. So to do so, I need to remind you of just a little bit of biochemistry. Fat quality matters. So the importance of fatty acids. So here's what biochemists show us if you ever take chemistry. They depict our fats as fatty acids in these ways. So all fats have a carbon backbone, and then they have a bunch of hydrogens around it. And if it's a saturated fat, the carbon backbone has no double bonds. And we depict that with the number of carbons in the backbone and the number of double bonds. So this is a 16 carbon length fatty acid, and it has no double bonds, so it's a saturated fat. Here's one with a single double bond. That's what defines a monounsaturated fat. It has one double bond. And this particular one has 18 carbons in the backbone and one double bond, okay? Here's a polyunsaturated fat. It has more than one double bond. In this case, it has two. So we would depict it as an 18-2 polyunsaturated fat. Why am I emphasizing this? Because if you measure the fat composition of a migratory bird, in this case, red-eyed vireos caught on Block Island, you find this pattern. And this is the pattern you see in all migratory birds that are sampled during migration. They're composed of mostly 16-0, 18-1, and 18-2. There's like 50 different fatty acids. But for some reason, migratory birds are composed of just these three. Those of you who are paying attention are noticing that there's a 16-1 that's also important. But 16-1s biochemically are precursors to these. So they're essentially the same. They're monounsaturated. So birds do have sometimes more of the 16-1, in our case, red-eyed vireos, but these can easily be converted and very efficiently to 18-1. And most birds have these three fatty acids. So when we started thinking about the importance of fatty acid composition, one of the things that was immediately piquing our interest was there's only a few, and birds are what they eat when it comes to fatty acids. So what fat should our migratory birds eat? Well, if they are what they eat, and we know their fat composition changes seasonally, I didn't show you that, but I can show you the same information I showed you in the last slide for birds across the seasons, and they do change to being more polyunsaturated during migration. My question was, does it affect their exercise performance? So what? Does it matter that birds are composed of different things? Okay. So I'm about to show you results from two kinds of experiments, both related to this question. And this work literally takes an army. You'll see why in just a second, the way we do these studies. So this is the two studies. One was done in North America, and then the other study was done over in Germany. So this is us having a good time at Oktoberfest. And this is the army of folks that are involved in the experiments. Right behind this group is a wind tunnel. This is what we call the working section where the birds fly. So one of the two studies I'm going to talk about, we have birds flying for 6 hours at a time in this wind tunnel. And I'll tell you about a little bit more of those details just now. All right, so we have this army of folks that are going to conduct these two experiments. So one of the things that we did with red-eyed vireos was we fed them one of two diets. And we named the diets after the amount of unsaturated fats in the diet. So one was a 58% diet, unsaturated diet, and the other one was 82%. But what it meant in terms of the fatty acid composition of those diets, notice what the composition is, mostly 16-0 18.1 and 18.2, the diets were chosen to mirror what birds during migration are composed of. But we have two different diets. And the point was there's two main ideas for what fatty acid composition might be best for birds during migration. One idea is that it's the amount of 18.1, this monounsaturated fat, relative to the amount of polyunsaturated fat. So this particular diet, the 82% diet, has the highest ratio of this. So if that's the better performing composition, then that group, the 82%, should do better. But the other competing hypothesis is that no, it's actually all about the amount of these polyunsaturated fats. And so it would be this group, the 58% U diet, that would be able to outperform the other group. So we have two competing hypotheses. We devised the diets to be able to discriminate between those two. And then we measured exercise performance. So in this red-eyed vireo study, here's how we did that. First of all, we measured resting metabolic rate. So here's how you do it in a bird. You do it overnight in the dark. You do it at this temperature because the birds don't have to expend any extra energy for thermoregulation at this temperature. And you don't feed them for at least 10 hours prior to measuring metabolic rate. Okay, so that's resting metabolic rate. It simulates what a bird at rest would be expending. And then we measure active metabolic rate. We exercise them for about 20 minutes in this, what we affectionately call the flight hover wheel. So it's rotated really quickly. There's a few ping pong balls in the bottom. It forces the bird to hop and hover to stay away from the ping pong balls. And the whole thing is enclosed so we can measure oxygen consumption and CO2 production in that time. Those of you who are paying attention know this is not a red-eyed vireo. It's just a favorite stuffed animal that we're using to show you what this thing looks like. Okay, so we do that until the bird's exhausted. That takes about 20 minutes most of the time. How do you know the bird's exhausted? Because it just starts going around and around and around on this nice little hover wheel. Okay, so what do we find out using this kind of an approach? So here's the information on resting metabolic rate. There's no difference between the diet groups in terms of resting metabolic rate. But when we measure the active metabolic rates, how far they can go, how quickly, it's the birds fed the 58% U diet that can go further faster. So they have a higher maximum metabolic rate compared to this other group. Okay, so if you remember, those are the birds, it's these birds that have more of the 18.2. Okay, so this supported the hypothesis that it has more to do with how much polyunsaturated fats the birds are composed of, not so much the relative amounts of 18.1 and 18.2. But every time I would talk about this study, and probably some of you are feeling the same way, I would always get questions about, well, isn't this kind of a contrived kind of thing, this whole hover flight wheel? Maybe you're stressing them out too much. Maybe that's not, maybe going higher, faster isn't necessarily good. Maybe it's better to actually expend less during that same thing. And I agreed. It was a first step. It doesn't require as much effort as what I'm just about to show you. But what this led is us to study birds flying in wind tunnels. So we went over to Germany. We took European starlings from nest boxes. We hand raised them. And then we've allowed them to grow up during the summer. And then we started them on experimental diets. This is what the experimental diet looks like. It looks like a little MASH diet that we can very carefully compose. And then we had two groups, just like we did in this earlier study with vireos. And then we flew them for 6 hours and measured their energy expenditure during that time. Okay, so these are birds that have never flown anywhere else other than in the wind tunnel. And so we think they're behaving as less stressed as we possibly can. And they're fed two different diets so we can look directly at what the composition of the diet does in terms of exercise performance. Here's the composition of the birds. Okay, so this is the MUFA birds and the PUFA birds, as we affectionately call them. If it's the amount of 18.1 relative to 18.2, mostly monounsaturated relative to polyunsaturated, the MUFA group should have the better exercise performance. If it's the overall amount of polyunsaturated fats, then the PUFA group should be having the greater exercise performance. All right, so how do we do this? We've got birds composed of two different things. We now have to figure out an exercise performance measure. So here's how we do it. Here's the wind tunnel. The working section that I showed you behind those other groups is right here. There's an entire building devoted to producing the wind that then goes through this working section. And it's incredibly laminar flow. It's very even throughout. We can adjust the speed, we can adjust the temperature. What's not shown on here is there's a planetarium above it, so we can simulate the star patterns that they would normally be exhibiting during migration. And then over a period of about 2 weeks, we train them, and we just increase the amount of flying time that they have in the wind tunnel. This is each day. We ramp them up to 3-hour flights, give them a rest day, a few shorter flight days, and then on day 15, we ask them to fly for 6 hours. And we measure their energy expenditure during that time. All right, so we did this for 36 birds. Here's the results slide. So for people like me, this is always a sobering thing. So I'm showing you one slide that summarizes 3.5 months of work with these birds in the wind tunnel, training them to fly, doing all the measurements that we need to, okay? And we were able to fly 33 of 36 of these birds for 6 hours on day 15. And what I'm showing you here is the resting metabolic rate or basing metabolic rate. There's no difference between the diets, just like we found in the Vireo study. And what we found was the birds that were composed of those more polyunsaturated fats flew the same exact 6 hours, 11% cheaper. I'm pausing because that's kind of an astounding thing, okay? All we've done is manipulate the fatty acid composition of these birds and fly them for exactly the same period of time. And the birds that have more polyunsaturated fats in their fat stores can fly the same exact 6 hours, 11% cheaper, okay? So I want to emphasize with words what I've just shown you. So birds with more of the polyunsaturated fats had a higher capacity to increase metabolic rate during the short, intense exercise. So that's the Vireo study. Birds with more polyunsaturated fats expended less energy during the same long distance endurance exercise. Okay, that's what I just showed you with the starlings. So the implication is that diet selection during migration likely affects the energy costs of migration. Birds can expend 11% less on a given migration if they've found in the environment those polyunsaturated fats that allows them to gain that efficiency. Pretty cool. So what that led to was thinking back on our list of fruit species that we know birds like, okay? I'm not going to show you the data today, but I can tell you that arrowwood has a really nice complement of polyunsaturated fats. Pokeweed is especially good in terms of its long chain polyunsaturated fats. So this particular preference of birds that we showed with that bagging experiment is now being able to explain why they like this in terms of these macronutrients, but also in terms of micronutrients. There's particular fatty acids that we think are very important for birds to acquire during migration that allows them to do that migration more cheaply. All right, so there's one other little aspect to this study that I want to make sure you know, and that is this, that antioxidants, another micronutrient, seems to matter. So all animals, including you, have an antioxidant system. And the antioxidant system is designed to take pro-oxidants or reactive oxygen species that your body produces during normal metabolism. And if you exercise, it produces even more. And so we have this antioxidant system that intercepts these pro-oxidants and quenches them, as we like to say, so that there's less oxidative damage that occurs. If oxidative damage occurs, then your body has to do a bunch of repair. It can be quite costly. And if you have greater antioxidant capacity, then you can minimize the amount of oxidative damage that occurs, okay? And we get that antioxidant capacity in part from our diet, right? You can look on most any cereal box, and these days they're talking, or juices. We're constantly bombarded by how dietary antioxidants are important to us. So we can acquire some of those antioxidants in their diet, but all animals also have an endogenous antioxidant system, something internal to us that we can also upregulate if we need to, Okay, so we've become very interested in the antioxidant system of birds and how it influences the level of oxidative damage that they experience. So in the same study that I just talked about with European starlings, we bothered to measure their antioxidant system. And here's what I want you to take away from this. So we've got three measures: uric acid, the overall antioxidant capacity, and the oxidative damage. So if these things are working, we should see lower levels of the oxidative damage. And I'm showing you two different scenarios. This is during the training period. And then this is just a measure before any of the training of the birds on the two diets, okay? And I just want you to notice a couple things. First of all, uric acid is a byproduct of protein metabolism in birds. You know it, even though you might not know, because uric acid is the white stuff in bird poop. So that's what gets all over your car when you place it in the wrong place and birds decide to use it as a laboratory. So you have this uric acid production. And what this is showing is that the uric acid production of birds that are in flight, that are trained, increases during that flight. So birds are actually increasing the protein metabolism to increase uric acid and thus deal with, increase their antioxidant capacity and thus deal with the increased potential oxidative damage. And then it goes down. As soon as they stop training, within 2 days, they reduce that so that it's the same as sedentary birds. We didn't see any change in overall antioxidant capacity or oxidative damage during that flight. So what this means is no change in oxidative damage means this increase in uric acid was effective, right? We didn't see a change in oxidative damage. However, if you looked at birds fed these different diets, we didn't see any difference between the diet groups in terms of overall uric acid or antioxidant capacity, but look what happens with polyunsaturated fat fed birds. They have higher baseline levels of oxidative damage. So there seems to be a cost associated with becoming more polyunsaturated. So what I said in words, again, for emphasis, I've shown you that birds increase protein catabolism and thus uric acid production to combat the acute effects of a flight. We didn't see any acute effect of flight on oxidative damage, which is actually unlike a few other studies that have been done. But importantly, PUFA-fed birds had greater oxidative damage. So there seems to be an oxidative cost that applies all the time for birds fed the polyunsaturated fat diets. This may explain why birds during migration choose to feed on foods like fruits that have these particular kinds of fatty acids. But then as soon as they finish their migration, they switch their diet away from those things. And this may be why, to avoid that oxidative cost. So this has led to our current proposed thinking on things. We think there's an energy savings oxidative cost trade-off for birds during migration. First of all, migratory birds composed of more polyunsaturated fat gain that energy savings that I told you about, but the potential importance of those, but there's an oxidative cost for that. So this leads to the potential importance of dietary antioxidants to alleviate these oxidative costs. Where do birds get these? Guess what? Any of the fruits that have colors, so the purplish fruits of viburnum or the reddish fruits of winterberry, those colors are for the most part produced by dietary antioxidants. They're actually color cues for birds so that they know where in the environment these antioxidants are found. So we're currently studying how important those dietary antioxidants are for birds during migration especially. So stay tuned for results on that. So I've told you 3 stories: habitat management for wintering waterfowl, protein requirements of birds during migration, and then fatty acids and antioxidants for birds during migration. And I hope that in the course of telling you those 3 stories, you've gained an appreciation for the importance of nutritional and physiological ecology, and especially how it's important for our understanding about how to manage habitat and conserve birds. And with that, I'll thank all the folks who have helped fund this work, and I'll be happy to take any questions if we have time. They're the same thing. So that is the common name for viburnum. It's called arrowwood. Do be careful. One of the things that we found out when we were conveying what we had done to the local nurseries to produce some of these fruiting plants for people to plant. It turns out that the typical viburnums that, at least here in New England, the nurseries used to carry are not native species to our area. They were just easy to cultivate. So luckily there's this, in our neck of the woods, there's this Rhody native push. So a bunch of folks now are actually going out of their way and producing local varieties of viburnum. So the specific species that I talked about was Viburnum dentatum, but it's generically called arrowwood. And it's that particular one that we suggest folks in our neck of the woods plant. So when we do these kind of captive bird studies, almost all the time we're trying to relate it to the ecology of the birds. And so to the extent possible, we try to build into any of these captive bird experiments as ecologically relevant stuff as we can to minimize any kind of stress that the birds may have, and to basically simulate as best we can what the ecological conditions are. So when they built this particular wind tunnel, they actually had two inventions. One was the planetarium, and then the other was for day migrants. They actually had a little video image thing that went below the birds to simulate the movement of the landscape below them. They've decided in early studies that the landscape stuff, if anything, just confuses the birds, so most folks don't use that anymore. So instead, they only, if you have nocturnal migrants, the typical thing to do is to simulate the environment above them as if they were in migration. Yeah, so there's definitely an internal biological clock in birds. So if you do that same light manipulation during the breeding period or the wintering period, the birds don't respond to it. So you have to do it during the period of time that the birds can actually be photostimulated. During the other times, we call it photorefractive. Birds won't respond to changes in the light level during that time. So they definitely have a biological clock. In the particular, the question is specifically about our experiment. And in that experiment, the diets were constant during that whole time. So we didn't actually allow the birds to do any diet switching. They were on the same diet during the entire period of time. But it could very well be that in nature, if you did that light level manipulation and then gave birds choices of diets, maybe they'd show that they're switching diets, because that might be also internally programmed. But I don't know of studies that have done that. As far as I know, my group, and there's a group over in Europe that are the only ones that have ever measured the fatty acid composition of fruits. So I don't know what the fatty acid composition of that particular one is. So my guess is nobody knows. Thank you.